You can't really understand the meaning of a life until it's over. Not fully. It's like a story where the ending suddenly reshapes everything that came before it. That's why some traditions insist redemption can arrive even at the final moment. At first, that sounds suspiciously convenient, almost like a loophole. But if a life is truly a story unfolding in time, maybe the final turn matters more than we think. And that's exactly why trying to bring a long, complicated idea like this together feels a little nerve-wracking. When you begin looking honestly at the world, something unsettling appears almost immediately. Life isn't just a collection of pleasant moments moving gently forward. It's filled with fragility. People get sick, relationships break, entire societies collapse into war. And if you look at history long enough, it becomes impossible to ignore how often destruction shows up right beside progress. So the real question becomes difficult, almost uncomfortable to ask. If you refuse to hide behind comforting illusions, is optimism still possible? Because it's easy to feel hopeful when you're protected by a layer of distraction. It's much harder when you strip those layers away and look directly at suffering, mortality, and the uncertainty of existence. Many people have done exactly that, and some of them came away deeply shaken by what they found. Leo Tolstoy is one of the clearest examples. For much of his life, Tolstoy lived surrounded by success. He was famous, respected, wealthy, widely considered one of the greatest writers who had ever lived. From the outside, his life looked almost ideal. But eventually he began questioning everything that had once seemed meaningful. Fame didn't solve the problem of death. Wealth didn't answer the question of suffering. Intellectual brilliance didn't remove the strange fact that every human life eventually ends. And once Tolstoy started thinking about that, seriously, something in him broke open. He described a moment where the illusions that had protected him simply collapsed. When that happened, he looked at the world and saw something that felt almost unbearable. If you remove the comforting stories people tell themselves, the world can look brutally indifferent. People suffer, they struggle, they disappear. The cycle repeats endlessly. From a purely rational point of view, Tolstoy concluded that life itself seemed almost absurd. That realization pushed him toward a kind of despair that logic alone couldn't solve. The more clearly he analyzed existence, the less reason he could find to remain hopeful. It was as if the clearer his thinking became, the darker the world appeared. But something unexpected happened. Tolstoy didn't remain trapped in that bleak conclusion. The way he found his way out wasn't through a careful philosophical argument. It arrived in a different form entirely, through an image. He once described a dream that stayed with him. In the dream, he found himself suspended in empty space, hanging by a belt wrapped around his waist. Beneath him stretched an enormous pit of chaos. There was no solid ground below, no visible safety net. Just a vast drop into darkness. At first glance, that sounds terrifying. And yet the strange thing was that the dream comforted him. Why would an image like that bring comfort rather than fear? The answer seems to lie in the strange honesty of the picture. Human life does feel like that sometimes. We are suspended between stability and collapse. The structures holding us up, our relationships, our beliefs, our identities, can feel surprisingly thin. Beneath them lies a kind of uncertainty we can never completely eliminate. The dream didn't pretend that chaos wasn't there. It showed it clearly. But it also showed something else, the fact that Tolstoy was still being held up. Suspended, yes. Vulnerable, absolutely. But not falling. That image carried a deep emotional truth. It captured the human condition in a way that felt both frightening and strangely reassuring at the same time. Still, there's a problem with images like that. They work on the level of intuition, not analysis. You can feel the meaning in them. You can sense that they contain something important. But if you try to break them down rationally, if you try to examine their structure and ask exactly why they offer hope, the clarity disappears. The symbol slips through your fingers. And that creates an interesting challenge. Because if the image truly reflects something real about human existence, then perhaps it should be possible to understand why it works. Maybe the sense of hope contained inside that dream isn't just mystical or poetic. Maybe it reflects something deeper about the way human beings experience the world. That possibility opens the door to a much larger project. Instead of dismissing these ancient symbols as vague or irrational, you begin examining them more carefully. You look at them from different angles. You compare them with psychology, with neuroscience, with the long history of stories human beings have told about themselves. And when you do that, something curious begins to happen. At first, the ideas seem scattered, almost too complicated to hold together at once. But the more you return to them, the more the pieces begin to fit. A pattern slowly emerges, like a shape gradually coming into focus through fog. And with each pass through the material, the same realization quietly grows stronger. What Tolstoy glimpsed in that dream might not have been a vague mystical comfort after all. It might have been a symbolic glimpse of something structured, something that could, with enough patience, actually be understood. At the beginning of this exploration, there was a simple invitation. Try looking at the world in more than one way. Most of us are familiar with the first way because it dominates modern thinking. It's the materialist view. In that picture, the world is made of objects, solid things that exist independently of us. Tables, buildings, planets, atoms. Reality in this framework is essentially a collection of physical pieces arranged in space, moving according to rules we can measure and describe. That viewpoint has been incredibly powerful. It gave us modern science, engineering, medicine, and technology. When you look at the world as a system of objects and forces, you can analyze it, predict it, and manipulate it in astonishing ways. But there's something curious about that perspective. It quietly leaves out a large portion of what human beings actually experience. Because when you wake up in the morning, you don't encounter the world as a neutral grid of objects. You encounter it as a field of meaning. You wake up hungry or excited or anxious. You're thinking about a problem you have to solve or someone you're hoping to see. Maybe you're worried about a conversation you need to have later. The world doesn't appear as an abstract collection of things. It appears as a landscape shaped by your concerns, your motivations, your emotions. In other words, you experience the world through a story. This second way of seeing reality is narrative. It's centered not on objects, but on experience itself. In this frame, what matters most are the things that move us: emotions, motivations, ideals, fears, hopes, fantasies. These aren't decorations sitting on top of reality. They are part of the structure through which reality becomes visible to us in the first place. Think about something as simple as walking into your kitchen. From the perspective of strict materialism, the kitchen is a room containing objects, counters, cabinets, appliances, containers made of various materials. But that's not how you actually perceive it when you step inside. If you're hungry, the refrigerator becomes the center of the room. Your attention narrows immediately toward the things that might solve your problem. Food plates, utensils, maybe a knife to spread peanut butter. Everything else fades quietly into the background. The color of the wall, the exact shape of the cabinets, the countless details that physically exist in the room barely register at all. Your perception has already filtered the world before you even realize it. And that filtering happens because you're motivated. Emotion and motivation aren't secondary layers placed on top of perception. They are built into the act of perception itself. Neuroscience has been revealing something remarkable about this process. When you look at an object, your brain doesn't simply identify its physical form. At the same time, the motor systems that would allow you to interact with it begin activating. A chair, for example, is not just recognized visually as a shape with legs and a back. Your brain also prepares the actions associated with it: sitting, moving, leaning, using it as support. Perception is already intertwined with action. Even more interesting, sometimes emotion arrives before clear recognition. When you encounter something unfamiliar or potentially threatening, your body reacts almost instantly. Your heart rate shifts, your muscles tighten, your attention sharpens. That emotional response occurs before you fully understand what you're looking at. Your body prepares first. Only afterward does your mind catch up and try to label the object. That tells us something important. Perception is never neutral. It's always guided by the state you're in. Your needs, your fears, your desires, all of them shape what you see and how you interpret it. And this filtering process is unbelievably complicated. In fact, building the world of objects we take for granted requires years of development. When a child is born, the world doesn't appear as a stable set of recognizable things. Infants experience something much more chaotic. Shifting colors, movements, sensations, without clear boundaries. Over the first years of life, children slowly learn how to carve that sensory chaos into objects. They discover that certain shapes persist over time, that objects remain the same even when they disappear from view, that a toy is still the same toy when you rotate it, drop it, or pick it up again. This process takes thousands upon thousands of interactions with the environment. And by the time children can finally talk about the world clearly, most of that learning has already happened beneath the surface of awareness. They can't explain how they built the object world they now move through. They simply inhabit it. But underneath that stable world lies something much more fluid. Because even once the object world is constructed, we never actually perceive everything around us. The environment contains an overwhelming amount of information, far more than our brains could ever process at once. So perception always selects tiny fragments. You move from one place to another, focusing only on what matters in that moment. The rest fades into invisibility. And those selections constantly shift as your motivations change. If you're thirsty, the world reorganizes itself around the search for water. If you're interested in someone across the room, suddenly your attention locks onto their gestures, their voice, their expressions. If someone begins telling you a story, your perspective can even slide into their frame of reference, allowing you to momentarily see the world through their eyes. The same physical environment can appear in countless different ways depending on what you're trying to do, which means something profound follows from all of this. The world we experience isn't just a fixed set of objects waiting to be observed. It's a dynamic field shaped by interaction, by goals, by attention, by embodied readiness to act. And once you realize that the narrative perspective begins to look less like a poetic metaphor and more like a fundamental layer of reality, we don't simply live among objects, we live inside patterns of meaning. Once you start noticing how perception is guided by purpose, the world begins to look less fixed than it first appeared. The objects around you aren't just static things sitting there with one single meaning. What they are depends surprisingly often on what you are trying to do. Take something ordinary, a chair. If you walk into a room tired after a long day, the chair immediately presents itself as a place to sit. That's its obvious identity. But imagine a different situation. You're standing beneath a light fixture trying to reach a bulb that's just out of reach. Suddenly, the chair is no longer primarily a place to rest. Now it's a step, a platform, a temporary ladder. Same object, completely different meaning. And that shift didn't happen because the chair itself changed. The change happened because your goal changed. This happens constantly, though most of the time we barely notice it. The world quietly rearranges itself around our intentions. Objects step forward or retreat into the background depending on whether they help us move from where we are to where we're trying to go. You might walk past a table 10 times without really seeing it. But the moment you need something to stand on or somewhere to place a stack of books, that same table suddenly becomes important. It reveals a new possibility. In that sense, what something is cannot be separated from how it can be used. A chair is a chair if you want to sit. A stool if you need elevation. A barricade if you're trying to block a door. A makeshift tool if you're trying to reach something just beyond your grasp. And once you start thinking this way, the world becomes strangely open-ended. Because human beings are incredibly good at discovering new uses for things, we are constantly reinterpreting the environment through new goals, new needs, new ideas. What once seemed like a fixed object suddenly becomes part of an entirely different possibility. If you step back and look at human history, you can see this process unfolding on an enormous scale. Take something as simple as sand. For most of human history, sand was just sand, tiny grains of minerals scattered across deserts and beaches. But at some point, people began experimenting with its properties. They learned how to melt it into glass. Later, they learned how to purify certain elements inside it, silicon in particular. And eventually, through a long chain of discoveries, human beings realized that this humble material could be shaped into something extraordinary. From silicon wafers, we built microchips. From microchips, we built computers. From computers, we built networks that connect millions, then billions of people across the planet. Entire libraries of information can now exist inside devices small enough to fit in your pocket. Conversations travel instantly across continents. Knowledge that once required lifetimes to gather can now appear in seconds. All of that from sand. Which raises a strange question. If a material as ordinary as sand contains the potential for something like that, then what exactly is this world we're interacting with? Because the possibilities hidden inside matter seem almost endless. But here's the really curious part. Those possibilities don't reveal themselves automatically. They appear when human beings interact with the world in new ways. When someone asks a different question, when someone experiments with a different purpose in mind. The material itself contains certain properties, of course, but those properties only become meaningful through engagement. In other words, the world isn't just sitting there passively waiting to be described. It's constantly revealing new aspects of itself through action, and that begins to blur the line between the world of objects and the world of stories. Because when you think about it carefully, human action is always guided by narrative. We pursue goals. We solve problems. We move towards something we value while trying to avoid something we fear. Our lives unfold as sequences of challenges, decisions, and transformations. Within that narrative structure, the environment takes on meaning. Objects become tools. Obstacles, opportunities, or dangers depending on the role they play in the story we're living through. Which leads to a provocative thought. What if the world of stories, the world shaped by goals, values, and actions, is not just a subjective overlay placed on top of a more real object world? What if in some sense it comes first? What if the object world we describe with science is actually something that emerges out of the deeper structure of experience? The structure where meaning, purpose, and possibility guide what we notice and what we create. If that's true, then understanding human life might require taking the story world far more seriously than we usually do. Most of life moves along inside familiar patterns. You wake up, move through your routine, solve small problems, make plans, respond to what you expect will happen next. In those moments, the world feels understandable. You know roughly where things are going. Your assumptions hold. Your mental map of reality continues working the way it always has. But the real challenge of life doesn't appear when everything makes sense. The real challenge appears when something happens that doesn't fit your map at all. Everyone eventually runs into moments like that. An event arrives that shatters the framework you've been using to understand the world. Suddenly, the rules that guided your expectations stop working. What you thought was stable isn't stable. What you assumed was predictable turns uncertain. When that happens, the problem isn't simply that something bad occurred. The deeper problem is that you no longer understand what is happening. A striking example appeared during one of the most shocking public catastrophes in recent memory. After the towers collapsed, millions of people found themselves doing something unusual. They watched the footage again, and again, and again. At first glance, that behavior seems strange. Why replay the same horrifying event repeatedly? Why voluntarily expose yourself to something so disturbing? But if you ask someone why they were watching it over and over, the answer often sounded something like this: "I can't believe it," or "I'm trying to understand what happened." Those words reveal something deeper, because what they really mean is that the event exceeded their capacity to comprehend it. The mind was trying to rebuild a broken model of reality. Something enormous had shattered, but what exactly had shattered? Was it just two buildings falling? Was it thousands of lives lost? Was it the stability of a country? Was it the sense of safety people once assumed about their world? When an event like that occurs, it's not immediately clear what has actually been destroyed. And until you understand that, your mind keeps returning to the scene, replaying it again and again, trying to reconstruct meaning. But here's the strange part. When you encounter something that far outside your expectations, your first response doesn't come from careful thought. It comes from your body. Before you form a clear explanation, before you create a coherent story about what happened, your nervous system reacts. Your heart rate changes. Your muscles tense. Your breathing shifts. A flood of emotion appears. Fear, confusion, anger, disbelief. Only later does the intellectual process begin. In other words, the unknown is first experienced physically and emotionally. The conceptual understanding comes afterward, if it comes at all. And sometimes it never fully does. Events that are powerful enough can leave people permanently disoriented. They never quite manage to rebuild a stable framework for understanding what happened. Their lives become organized around the shock itself. You can see a quieter version of this in personal grief. Consider a couple who have lived together for decades. Their lives become intertwined in thousands of invisible ways. Shared routines, shared expectations, shared interpretations of the world. The presence of the other person becomes part of the structure through which reality makes sense. Then suddenly, that person is gone. When that happens, the loss is not just emotional, it's structural. The framework that organized daily life collapses. Even small decisions can become strangely difficult. The absence produces a deep uncertainty that affects the body as much as the mind. That's one reason why the death of a long-term partner can significantly increase the risk of illness or even death in the surviving spouse within the following year. The shock to the system is not just psychological, it's physiological. And that physiological reaction is closely tied to stress. When your frame of reference collapses, your body enters a state of alarm. Stress hormones flood your system. One of the primary ones is cortisol, which prepares the body to deal with threat. In short bursts, that response is useful. It sharpens attention and mobilizes energy. But when it continues for long periods, it becomes deeply harmful. Chronically elevated cortisol damages the body in multiple ways. It interferes with memory systems in the brain. It weakens the immune system. It raises the risk of cardiovascular disease. Over time, it even increases vulnerability to certain cancers. Living inside prolonged uncertainty is physically exhausting, which helps explain something about human behavior that often seems puzzling. People fiercely defend their beliefs, political views, ideological positions, religious commitments, cultural narratives. On the surface, those arguments appear to be about abstract ideas, but underneath, something more fundamental is happening. Those belief systems form part of the framework people use to organize reality. They provide structure, predictability, and orientation. When someone challenges that framework, the reaction can feel intensely personal, even threatening. Because from the inside, it is. If your worldview collapses, the psychological and physiological consequences can be severe. The body reacts as if it has been thrown into chaos. Anxiety rises, stress hormones surge, the sense of stability disappears, and that is a state human beings will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid. The unknown isn't just intellectually uncomfortable, it shakes the entire system. Once you understand how disruptive the unknown can be, it becomes obvious why people try so hard to avoid it. When your assumptions collapse, everything feels unstable. Your body reacts with stress, your mind scrambles for explanations, and the world suddenly looks unpredictable. From that perspective, the safest strategy might seem obvious. Stay inside what you already understand. Protect the structure you've built. Avoid the chaos waiting outside it. But something about that strategy doesn't quite work. Because if you pay attention to how life actually unfolds, you notice something surprising. Almost everything valuable you've ever learned came from stepping into territory you didn't understand yet. Every skill you developed began in confusion. Every meaningful relationship started with uncertainty. Every new idea required entering a space where you didn't yet know what you were doing. The unknown is frightening, yes, but it's also where information lives. It's where possibility lives. If you seal yourself off from it completely, you don't just protect yourself from danger, you also cut yourself off from growth. And that creates a strange paradox. The same chaotic space that threatens to overwhelm you is also the place where transformation becomes possible. Think about how you actually explore the world. Your attention is usually focused on what you already understand. That's efficient. It allows you to function without constantly being overwhelmed. But every once in a while, something unexpected appears, a problem, a failure, a question you can't answer. Suddenly, the boundaries of your knowledge become visible. At first, that moment feels uncomfortable, but inside that discomfort is information you didn't have before. The unknown contains details about reality that your current framework hasn't yet captured. And if you're willing to examine it carefully, gradually, you begin expanding your understanding. Your map of the world grows more accurate. That's how learning happens. It also reveals something deeper about existence itself. Human beings are limited creatures. We perceive the world from a narrow perspective. We have incomplete knowledge, fragile bodies, and finite time. Those limitations mean that uncertainty will always be part of life. No matter how much you learn, there will always be more that you don't understand. And that means suffering, confusion, and disruption can never be eliminated completely. They are built into the structure of being alive. At first, that realization might sound discouraging, but it leads to an unexpected insight. If chaos cannot be removed from life, then perhaps the goal isn't to eliminate it. Perhaps the goal is to find the right relationship with it. Because when you look closely at human behavior, something curious appears. People often claim they want a perfectly safe and predictable life, but when everything becomes too stable, something strange begins to happen. Boredom creeps in. A life without challenge quickly starts to feel empty. Imagine having unlimited comfort, plenty of food, endless entertainment, no responsibilities, nothing demanding your attention. At first that might sound appealing, but after a while the absence of difficulty becomes its own kind of problem. Human beings seem to need something to struggle with. You can see it in children. Give them a perfectly controlled environment with nothing uncertain or challenging, and they quickly begin searching for trouble. They invent games, push boundaries, explore things they're told to avoid. Not because they want suffering, but because they want engagement. A completely ordered world turns out to be just as unbearable as a completely chaotic one. Too much chaos overwhelms you. Too much order suffocates you. The sweet spot lies somewhere between those two extremes. A good life seems to require a strange kind of balance. One foot stands on stable ground, the routines, relationships, and structures that provide security. The other foot steps carefully into the unknown, the challenges, risks, and discoveries that keep life meaningful. When those two elements exist together, something remarkable happens. You feel alert without being terrified, engaged without being overwhelmed, secure enough to explore but challenged enough to grow. That balance creates a state where life becomes vivid. The world feels alive with possibility, but not so chaotic that it destroys your ability to move forward. And perhaps that balance between order and chaos is where human beings function best. If you start watching your own experience carefully, you might notice something interesting about the moments when life feels most bearable. Not necessarily when everything is comfortable, and not even when everything is going your way. Instead, it's those strange stretches of time when you become deeply absorbed in something. Think about what that feels like. You're working on a problem or building something or having a conversation that pulls you in completely. Your attention narrows, but not in a stressful way. You're focused, curious, alert. And somewhere in that process, something subtle happens. You stop thinking about yourself. Your usual self-conscious commentary, the little voice wondering how you look, how you sound, whether you're doing well enough, quietly disappears. Instead of standing outside the moment judging it, you're simply inside it. And then time begins to behave strangely. An hour passes, maybe two, and it feels like minutes. Or sometimes the opposite happens. A short stretch of time becomes so rich with detail that it feels longer than it really is. Either way, your normal awareness of the clock fades away. Even your usual worries loosen their grip. The endless background concerns about mortality, vulnerability, and uncertainty, the heavy questions that sometimes haunt human consciousness, fall silent for a while. Not because they've been solved, but because they've been replaced by something more immediate. Engagement. In those moments, your whole system seems aligned with what you're doing. Your mind, your body, your attention, all moving in the same direction. It's a state that feels natural, almost childlike. Children slip into it constantly. They become absorbed in play without constantly stepping outside the experience to analyze it. And when you watch those moments closely, a quiet question starts to emerge. If human beings can enter a state like that at all, shouldn't we pay attention to it? Because it suggests something important about how we're built. Our systems seem designed to function best when we're moving towards something that genuinely interests us. Not something we're forced into, not something we're pretending to care about, but something that actually catches our attention. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. because the next question appears almost immediately. Can interest be trusted? After all, human beings can be drawn toward things that aren't good for them. History is full of examples. People become fascinated by destructive ideas, dangerous behaviors, even violence itself. Curiosity alone doesn't automatically guarantee wisdom. So the question becomes serious. What if following your interest leads you somewhere terrible? That possibility forces us to look more closely at what a human being actually is. Imagine for a moment that you are something like an extraordinarily complex biological system. Something as intricate as a high-powered computer, but far more sophisticated. Your nervous system processes enormous amounts of information, constantly adjusting how you perceive the world and how you move through it. Now imagine feeding that system distorted information. What happens to a computer when you give it faulty data? The output becomes faulty too. The same thing seems to apply to human beings. The systems that guide our interests, our motivations, and our sense of direction are incredibly sensitive to the information we feed them. When we lie to ourselves, when we avoid uncomfortable truths, when we pretend not to see things we actually know, we quietly distort the internal signals that guide us. At first, that distortion might seem small. A small compromise here, a convenient denial there. But over time, those distortions accumulate. The internal compass begins to drift. What once felt meaningful becomes confusing. Interests become misaligned. A person may chase goals that don't actually lead anywhere satisfying or avoid challenges that might have helped them grow. And eventually, the system itself becomes unreliable. This is where honesty stops being just a moral rule. It becomes something much more practical. Truthfulness is part of how the human organism stays properly oriented in the world. When you face reality, even when it's uncomfortable, you keep the internal guidance systems functioning correctly. Your curiosity remains sensitive. Your attention continues pointing toward problems that need solving and opportunities that deserve exploration. And when that orientation remains intact, something remarkable happens. The state of engagement becomes easier to enter. You find yourself drawn into meaningful activity more often. Your system begins to trust its own signals again. Exploration becomes energizing rather than frightening. And the more you move in that direction, the more resilient you become, able to face difficulty without collapsing under it, able to encounter the unknown without losing your footing. In that sense, truthfulness isn't simply about being virtuous. It's about staying alive to possibility. If there's one practical rule that seems to appear again and again, it's this: the unknown never disappears. You can postpone it. You can ignore it. You can convince yourself that the problem isn't really there. But sooner or later, anomaly returns. Something unexpected will happen. A mistake will surface. A relationship will break in a way you didn't anticipate. A weakness you avoided looking at will finally step into the open. And when that moment comes, the real question is not whether the unknown exists. The question is how you respond to it, because avoiding it carries a hidden cost. When you refuse to face a problem, it doesn't simply vanish. It waits. And while it waits, it grows. The misunderstanding becomes more complicated. The fear becomes heavier. The consequences spread outward into other parts of life. Eventually, you meet the same problem again, but now it's larger than it was before. That's why the ancient stories often describe the unknown as a dragon. The dragon represents the chaotic territory you don't yet understand. It guards the things you need but haven't yet learned how to obtain. And like every dragon in those stories, it's dangerous. It can hurt you. It can defeat you. There's no guarantee that confronting it will be easy, but the alternative is worse. If you run away from one dragon, another will appear further down the road. And the longer you avoid them, the larger they become. Eventually, the weight of all those avoided confrontations begins to press down on your life. Your confidence shrinks. Your world narrows. The unknown becomes something you fear so deeply that you stop exploring altogether. That path leads somewhere dark. But if you face the dragon carefully and perfectly, sometimes painfully, you gain something in return. You learn something about the world that you didn't know before. You learn something about yourself. The territory that once terrified you becomes partially understood. and that understanding becomes part of your strength moving forward. That pattern has been recognized for a very long time. In fact, in the late 1950s, a remarkable discovery was made in a cave, a collection of ancient writings that had been hidden for centuries. Among them were early texts connected to a branch of Christianity that had largely disappeared from history. These writings included a series of sayings attributed to Christ's short statements that carried a striking kind of psychological depth. One of those sayings captures this entire idea with surprising clarity. It goes something like this: if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Think about that for a moment. Inside every person there are possibilities, waiting to emerge, ideas, talents, truths, even difficult realizations about who they are and what they need to confront. When those things are expressed, explored, and integrated into life, they become sources of strength. But when they remain buried, ignored, denied, hidden away, they don't simply disappear. They wait. And over time, they can turn into something destructive. Regret, resentment, fear, a growing sense that something important was left undone. So the message becomes clear. The unknown will always exist. Dragons will always appear. But the things you need most in life are often hidden exactly where you're most afraid to look. And bringing those things forward, however difficult that may be, is what allows a life to move toward meaning rather than away from it. The unknown will always be there, waiting just beyond the edge of what we understand. We can avoid it for a while, but not forever. Eventually, life asks us to face what we've ignored, to bring forward what's been left buried inside. And sometimes that quiet courage changes everything. If this reflection gave you something to think about, you can leave a like, subscribe, if you'd like to stay with these conversations and keep exploring the questions that shape how we live.